My government has not agreed to any missile testing.
They are the focus of evil in the modern world.
I welcome you all to the nation's capital in this historic National Taxation Summit.
You've really induced a depression, haven't you?
When you're gone, you're a banana republic.
The ban on uranium exports to France has failed to serve its original purpose. Order!
I simply want to say that the contribution that Paul Keating has made to lifting the level of community debate both before and at this summit has been without parallel and without equal. And I want to say personally that in the process that we've gone through from the beginning of this exercise and up to and through the summit itself, that no Prime Minister could have asked for better, closer, more effective cooperation than I have enjoyed with Paul Keating. Thank you, Paul.
By 1985, Bob Hawke and Paul Keating had forged an immensely powerful relationship. But behind the scenes, it was a different story. Hawke's prime ministership had been weakened by family tragedy, and Keating was scathing of his leadership.
From the end of 1984 through to really, early 1988, it was a period when the cabinet made the orders of the day, made the pace, and not Bob, and where the rest of us had to provide the leadership. I was very peeved about the tax summit idea because I could think of nothing worse than making tax policy in public. Nothing worse. It was the antithesis of political efficiency.
It was during the 1984 election campaign that Bob Hawke gave an off-the-cuff commitment to tax reform. Instead of putting a policy, he announced a summit.
While in a sense it may have appeared to have a sort of knee-jerk reaction to something that happened on a particular program during an election, and there was a sense of that, it still reflected my basic philosophy about how it made sense to go about making fundamental changes.
We were stuck with that because of the lack of discipline which had been displayed by Bob in that time during the campaign period. That is, it was suggested to him and he picked it up. So we were stuck with it.
For years, Australia's tax system had been a disgrace. The main burden fell on ordinary workers, while the rich sank their tax to the bottom of the harbour. In Canberra, the ramshackle tax system had constantly frustrated Treasury officials. Now their big chance for reform had come. They worked night and day preparing options for Keating to study over Christmas 1984. The reform Treasury most wanted was dynamite, a huge new consumption tax.
It was audacious in its breadth and depth, because you must remember this wasn't simply a massive consumption tax reform exercise, it was also a massive income tax reform exercise. And as such, by far the biggest single reform that we'd had in the history of the Federation.
The bureaucracy was telling us that the Liberals had left the direct side tax system in a state of hemorrhage, that it was almost beyond repair, and that we would be better to try and collect income by expenditure, as the Europeans had done. And that's essentially where I think the consumption tax idea came from.
Keating poured through the options and became committed to a tax the Labor Party had always opposed.
Paul is a passionate proselytiser, and sometimes I think that passion has led him into self-delusion. His strength is that he is such a brilliant advocate. His weakness is that his powerful convictions can lead him into error.
He profoundly believed in the goods and services tax, the consumption tax. He was almost obsessed by it, to an extent that worried a lot of people around him.
We decided jointly to proceed with it in January of 1985, and his office and my office met at the Lodge with the relevant officers from the Prime Minister's Department and the Treasury. They actually were a bureaucratic group. They produced a piece of paper between them. It was a joint effort.
Hawke was cautiously in favour, but that was an attitude which was to be repeated continually. There would be cautious support, followed by some backsliding, followed by support. But initially we came away from that meeting at the Lodge feeling that Hawke was going to support this package.
What was worth doing was testing it. I mean, I was not prepared to take the view that some of my advisors and a whole lot of other people were saying, kill it. There was enough in the proposal to warrant detailed examination.
Keating and Treasury officials bunkered down in a little-used training room on the ground floor of Treasury, refining the grand plan for tax reform. It was a race against time. The summit was set for early July 1985.
People virtually lived there, people slept there, people worked through the night there, people brought their children in and put them under the desk there. It was, in my 20 years or so of a Treasury career, the most massive bureaucratic effort that I've ever seen.
While Keating and Treasury were fully immersed in tax reform, Hawke pursued his own passion. He took off overseas. By early 1985, he had already visited 17 countries. It was a time when fears of nuclear holocaust and East-West bitterness dominated world politics.
That signed legislation that will outlaw Russia forever. We begin bombing in 5 minutes.
Experts now believe that fully 1/3 of the Soviet Union's Theater nuclear missiles are deployed in the Soviet Far East. Such a strong military capability has far-reaching implications.
They are the focus of evil in the modern world.
Hawke's trip blew up in his face over one of the most deadly missiles in the US arsenal, the MX.
President Reagan has dubbed the MX missile the Peacemaker. It's the most fearsome nuclear missile yet produced, armed with 10 nuclear warheads.
We begin with Mr. Hawke and a wave of opinion right across the country, which is opposed to his government's decision to involve Australia in America's MX nuclear missile program.
It was put to me that it would be very difficult and very significantly more expensive to undertake the testing of the MX without the capacity for American aircraft to have access to our airfields for the purpose of monitoring splashdown.
When the story broke in February 1985, Hawke had just touched down in Europe. The Prime Minister found himself swamped by a crisis at home.
We got to Brussels, and of course time there was taken up in very large measure by calls back to Australia and to Tokyo, where Richardson was.
I mean, everyone was trying to get hold of me to tell me that disasters were occurring. I can remember Beazley ringing me. There were all sorts of people very worried at the time.
There was a general conveying that things were a bit unhappy and one might say tempestuous in the caucus.
From Tokyo, right-wing numbers man Graham Richardson delivered the message very clearly: back off.
I don't think it was a matter of debate. To try and win in the caucus on the MX would have been just about impossible. I mean, you might have done it, but I doubt it. And in any event, it's a hell of a risk over nothing. Also, if it wasn't worth the fight, why have it? So I just said, well, I think you got on the wrong tram, you better get off it.
Paul Keating took time out from tax reform to give the opposite advice.
So I said to him, look, you haven't asked me for my view, but I'm ringing to tell you he was in Belgium or somewhere. He'd spoken to everyone else but not me, but because he knew what I'd say, I suppose. And I said to him, look, you know, for what it's worth, I think you should, you know, you should agree to go along and test this thing and get it out of the way.
Of course, I took virtually no notice of this because really Paul Keating was not across foreign affairs.
Hawke went on to Washington dreading international humiliation. He had to ask the Americans to release him from his undertaking. What Hawke had going for him was an extremely close relationship with the Americans.
I guess I first got working with him when I was vice president, and he was not a protocol man. I think he didn't kind of make me feel, hey, you're not a chief of state, therefore you get less time. It was the other way around. He was very friendly. I remember his coming to our house and actually singing, had a couple of beers with me, and had a few other people around there, and we were all singing Waltzing Matilda and me off key, and his rendition was not much better.
I liked him. I think he liked me. We had known each other back in the days when I was president of the Bechtel companies. We did engineering and construction work in Australia, still do.
It was obviously for me a very significant advantage when I became Prime Minister to have as a personal friend the United States Secretary of State.
Mr Hawke had his problems when he arrived for talks with Secretary of State George Shultz, cooperate with the testing of the MX missile and be damned by his own party, or refuse and face criticism for letting down a major ally. But during 3 hours of discussions, a compromise was reached.
That there are a variety of ways to monitor an MX test, and that the monitoring effort need not involve the provision of Australian support. The decision has been made by the U.S. to conduct the MS tests without the use of Australian support arrangements.
You had a situation where George Shultz was in a position where his friend Bob Hawke was in obvious political difficulty, embarrassment, and I was indebted to my friend George Shultz for the constructive and helpful way in which he, with me, handled that issue. It wasn't the easiest position that either of us have ever been in. What annoyed me a little bit in Washington was to be told there that, in fact, with very little difficulty, the monitoring of the splashdown could be done by their ships. I don't know whether it was misleading.
There has never, to my knowledge, been any thought of misleading Australia. That would not be an intelligent thing for the United States to do, because you can't really get away with it, and it's not desirable between friends and allies, as we have been for so long.
And in the end, as I say, I had to deal with the problem as it existed, and I had a total commitment to the alliance relationship, to the maintenance of the joint facilities, and I wasn't going to create additional difficulties by questioning whether there had been some deliberate misleading.
And he pulled off what, in the circumstances, can only be described as a miracle. To actually, without doing any substantial damage to our standing in relationship with the United States, he got George Shultz, against all the advice that George Shultz was receiving, to let us off the hook.
We didn't want to create a problem, and we didn't want to risk for that testing, which was important, but it shouldn't become the baby that went down with the dirty dishwater. I mean, the joint facilities were far more important.
The US bases or joint facilities in Australia were always the real issue for Washington and Canberra. The fear was the furor over MX would be used to force the closure of the bases, permanently damaging the Australia-US alliance. Resolving MX was crucial to saving the joint facilities.
Now, I think it was very important because what that did was to allow us time to work through the alliance issues with people in the Labor Party and with a very important public out there that had been over the years disenchanted with features of the alliance, and that ultimately let us convince them that the joint facilities served absolutely critical, important international purposes and that they should be sustained. Now, I don't think it would have been possible to do that in the context of having to really batten hatches down on MX.
After all the drama, the threats and so on, when I came back to Australia from the trip and went before the caucus and explained what had happened, we got something which was really quite remarkable, a unanimous resolution which contained support for the alliance and the joint facilities. And I regarded that as very significant.
One of the things that did happen after 1983 was that the Hawke government moved both domestic policy and foreign policy to the right, if you like. It, in a sense, captured the middle ground domestically, but certainly, Mr. Hawke put great store by the relationship, by maintaining the alliance relationship with the United States.
When you're dealing from common ground, it's not too hard. It's not too hard. It got complicated back in the Vietnam War days, but so I think there were some divisions that were a little tougher back then, but not anymore.
Bob Hawke had pulled off the big prize of cementing the Australia-US alliance by calming anti-US sentiment inside the Labor Party. The Treasurer and the media, however, had decided that the MX crisis had undermined Hawke.
I was filling in at that time, in terms of some authority in the place, the void which Bob had created during this down period. So I kept pressing on to continue to make the government look like a government that had policies and was pushing the things through. And I thought doing him a favour, because the government looked like it was really in charge of things and doing things, and it was.
What Paul Keating was doing was driving his tax cart, as he described his campaign for tax reform, into the middle of vast community opposition, particularly from the Labor Party.
A consumption tax was not acceptable to the ordinary members of the party. For my part, I must say that I found the notion of a tax on bread, on meat, fruit and vegetables, milk and so on, totally unacceptable. It was a complete anathema to everything that I understood that the Labor Party had stood for.
Keating was in desperate need of Hawke's support. He was forever upstairs arm-twisting the Prime Minister about the merits of Option C, as the consumption tax package was known. Hawke's staff were telling their boss to drop it.
I was one of the chief villains in the piece, from Paul's perspective. There were meetings where I simply cautioned and said, look, for goodness sake, if you check this and that out.
So there was this vacillation, on again, off again. We'd have a meeting, it would be decided, and then 2 weeks later, it would be all off. And then we'd have another meeting, it'd be all on. Another meeting, it'd be all off. And this went on, it was like a tennis match. You know, you could watch the ball going back and forwards over the net, and it probably happened 6 or 8 times.
You'd go in there and you'd played the grand final and you'd got him on board, only to find out, no, we've got to go back next Saturday and play the grand final again.
Bob, those documents have just arrived by courier. Not now, Paul. It's the X-rays of your spine, Bob. Well, why didn't you say so? Shut the door. I knew it, Paul. Nothing wrong with my backbone, no matter what Senator Walsh says. Isn't the human body wonderful? Release her to the press, will you?
Take these back to the museum and tell them their dinosaur ought to go into politics.
At the time that Option C was being discussed in 1985, the derogatory term about Hawke as old jellyback first appeared. It's been widely attributed to me. And I don't particularly mind it being attributed to me, but I didn't invent it.
The term jellyback has been used to describe a view of Hawke, and indeed Keating wasn't averse to using that way before Peter Walsh ever came on the scene and used it.
And as near as I can be certain, it was Peter Walsh's phrase. But it was the mood. The important thing was it was the mood of that ERC group. It was their view that Bob was shifting as the issues had come along. But it's not an expression which I had used ever in any other context. It was never my sort of expression. It was one of the others. But anyway, it didn't matter. I mean, Hawke's staff at the time fitted me up with it. The then Manchu Court, as I called them.
Yes, I got a lot of reports back of shit that was being spread. But I think people will tell you that throughout my life I've tended to be able to let that sort of thing go.
Bob Hawke was very much preoccupied with non-party issues. He'd had the difficulties with his daughter, particularly. That created a lot of tension between Keating and Hawke. I think at the time Keating didn't fully understand the pressures Hawke was under.
I've acknowledged myself the fact that in the period, the latter part of '84 and into the period covering the question of what we would do about a consumption tax or not, that I had other pressures on my mind, but that didn't prevent me in regard to that issue of being able to make, I think, appropriate judgments.
By May 1985, Canberra was bleak and dismal. Winter was looming, and with it the tax summit. Hawke, Keating and their advisers had been locked away, grappling with tax reform. Now it was Cabinet's turn to confront Keating's Option C. For 2.5 days, ministers were held prisoner while Paul Keating hammered them.
It was a meeting in which he charmed and cajoled and harassed and bullied his way through the assembled ranks. It was a classic example of Paul at his persuasive best.
He used rationality, he used his intellect, he used his charm, he used his humour, he used his anger, he used his theatrics, he used his spleen, he used his withering language. All of them turn and turn about. And it was the most remarkable performance I've ever seen in my years inside a cabinet room.
It was a gruelling meeting, not only because of the 2.5 days that meeting lasted, but because of the complexity of the material, the density of it, the requirement for intense concentration on figures and graphs and formulas and highly technical material that a number of the ministers would not deal with in a day-to-day sense and found extraordinarily difficult. I mean, you needed interpretation a lot of the time.
I was across the detail of this, as I've been across a few other things. I was across all the theoretical basis of these tax changes, and I was across all the technical aspects.
Hawke's role was unclear, really. He chaired the meeting, but it was hard to get a feeling as to where Hawke wanted to end up. As far as tax reform went, it was clear where he wanted to end up politically, and that was with a consensus package. But a consensus package probably wasn't going to contain a lot of major tax reform in it. So I suppose Hawke's role really was the political management of it. Keating was the technical tax reform expert.
you've got to blend all those considerations into your thinking. Say, now, what is the right thing? What's the best thing in terms of the country? What's the best things in terms of the interests of the government? And if you've locked yourself in early in the stage to saying this is, you know, what it must be, then you're a bloody idiot. And that I ain't.
For me, the breakthrough, I think, came about 1 a.m. on the Monday morning when Gareth Evans threw down his papers, took off his glasses and said, "I've listened to this argument for 2 days and I've been waiting for the hole to be punched in it, and none of you have been able to punch a hole in it."
Keating had won. Option C was now government policy.
It was genuine euphoria. This was a huge national debate on a reform that had eluded governments, successive governments, for decades. And now we seemed on the precipice of achieving it.
We then spent a month literally on election campaign, much more intensely than we had been at the 1984 election campaign. Going around the country with a plane load of journalists, it was almost like Keating was the Prime Minister. I remember at the time Rod Cameron was taking research and he would come back with numbers saying about 10% of people agreed and 90% didn't. We would sort of sit around and we'd have these sessions up in the cabinet room upstairs where Rod would come and report, and he'd be thumbing through this research, which was pretty disastrous.
And I think the results were fairly unequivocal, and these were publicised to, or they were disseminated within the top echelons of the party fairly widely. I think if Labor needed any convincing that it should adopt a basically anti-consumption tax position, then it got that message pretty forcefully in 1985.
I mean, in the end, it was just an impossible task. You couldn't, in 1 month, convince people from complete scratch that a concept like this was worthwhile doing.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is with sincere pleasure that I welcome you all to the nation's capital to take part in this historic National Taxation Summit conference.
By the time of the summit, opposition was total.
I'm deeply concerned by the proposal to extend the broad-based consumption tax to food.
The Business Council does not support approaches A, B or C.
We've heard a lot recently about Mr. Keating's so-called tax reform cart, and I think that's a very appropriate phrase because he has put the cart before the horse.
Farmers were here to fight fuel costs, capital gains tax, the consumption tax.
We will do all that is within our power to reduce the impact of costs upon you, and particularly in the fuel area. Now, my friends, I can understand.
By day 3 of the summit, Bob Hawke was unnerved, jolted into action. The Prime Minister decided to dump option C, and Keating with it.
Simon and I were staying at the International Hotel, along with the other members of the executive. Bob, on his way back from someplace, I think it was the Sports Institute, stopped in and saw us. We said to Bob, "Where's Paul? What's happening?" And Bob said, he'll be talking to him later, but he just wanted to know what our position was. I said, well, you know what our position is, that we can't accept option C.
I was home probably about 10 o'clock, sitting down to a meal, when I got a call from a journalist from the Sydney Morning Herald, John Short, who said Jeff Walsh, the Prime Minister's press secretary, is briefing the gallery that a deal has been done, that the broad-based consumption tax has been jettisoned, and he's done a deal for a modest extension of the existing indirect tax base. I told Short he had to be misinformed, that if there was any such deal, the Treasurer would have been sure to have heard of it, and I left him just 45 minutes earlier, and I simply couldn't believe it.
But it was true. By the next morning, option C was dead.
I want to allay any suspicions that the Treasurer has resigned. He's just running late. Paul, I just told them I want to allay any suspicions that you'd resigned. You were just running late. Ladies and gentlemen, it is not possible to say that there is broad community support for what was put as the preferred government option. We acknowledge that.
It's a bit like Ben Hur's. We've crossed the line with one wheel off.
At a press conference afterwards, Keating was gracious in defeat, concealing intense bitterness.
No Treasurer, the best intentions in the world, can get a reform proposal like this through a cabinet in this country without the support of the Prime Minister. I'm pleased to say, in the time I've been Treasurer, that support has been unqualified, and I appreciate it very much, and I'd like to take this public opportunity in front of you people who've written so much about our relations and this issue, just to say that support's always been there and I've always appreciated it.
I did say things which were kind to Bob at that time, even though he had abandoned me, because there was no point in me trying to beat up on him in the state he was in, the mood he was in. So I had to make the best of it. I mean, my job then was to keep the government together, to keep the show on the road, to look for the next practical opportunity to get changes through.
When I exercised the judgment that not only I had the right to, but the responsibility to exercise as Prime Minister, he was terribly upset about it, and he said some harsh things. I mean, he's given to invective and lashing out.
On the following week, I had to go in and interrupt a meeting that was in the Prime Minister's office, which I didn't know what it was about. I wasn't part of it. And Paul turned on me and turned around to Hawke and said, if you had any fucking guts, you'd sack this bastard, right? And you're gutless, and it was that sort of stuff.
Keating got on with the job nevertheless. On September 19, he unveiled a series of massive changes to the tax system, representing one of the biggest reforms in a decade of Labor. They included the fringe benefits tax, cutting business entertainment rorts, a capital gains tax, dividend imputation, and a cut in the top income tax rate from 60 to 49%. Keating was triumphant and angry, believing Hawke had put obstacles in his way, especially on the weekend the ministry met to endorse the final tax changes.
Bob started the day by some gratuitous attacks upon the proposals, and then left to fly to Papua New Guinea for some celebration, some national celebration there, and I had to get the package through without his support over the ensuing 2 days.
The Keating analysis is a pathetic rewriting of history. The fact is, of course, that after the summit, I encouraged the Treasurer to go ahead with the alternative approaches, and not only gave him my personal encouragement, but ensured that all the resources of my department and my economists were available and involved.
That was the first time that Bob and that was the first one I put back in the memory. The first one I really didn't forgive him for.
And I am proud indeed to be the leader of a team with such...
Keating by now was contemptuous of Hawke's leadership, believing his consensus style concealed a fear of reform.
I mean, I always thought a leader's job was to nourish the forces, make the big judgments, strike out with the big directions and follow them through. Bob's a far more discursive, till the soil, find out what's growing, see who wants to do this sort of thing.
What you've got to understand is about the whole approach to running a government that I've had. I mean, with all my ministers, and particularly as I see them develop in their capacity and a sense of authority, then that's what I want to see. I mean, so Like, go for your life. Now, obviously, Keating grew in knowledge and confidence in the job, and it was appropriate that he'd be allowed to go ahead and do it, just as I did with other ministers.
He was surrounded, fortunately, by, I think, an extremely dedicated and pretty talented group of ministers who all had, I think, pretty clear ideas about what they wanted to do, and he was able to manage that process, I think, very well, and to pretty good effect in terms of both policy outcomes and in terms of the standing of the government in the community.
In early 1986, Australians thought the good life would go on forever. The lucky country was a national catchphrase that epitomised how we saw ourselves. But an economic crisis was coming that would destroy national complacency and force a new view of Australia. Australia had to face up to being poorer. No longer would the old Hawke style of popular consensus be enough. A new, tougher style of government would be needed.
Fortitude, consistent Churchillian spirit is not one of Hawke's strong attributes. He's got many attributes, but that's not one of them, taking a consistent, unpopular position. The politics of optimism was very much his strong hand, and he ran with that from 83 through 85. In 1986, with the terms of trade crisis, we hit the rocks, and that called for a very different style of government.
It came to a head on May 13th, 1986, in a strange little ritual performed on the dot of 11:30.
At the third stroke, it will be 11:30 precisely.
The Bureau of Statistics figures on trade for the month before would slash through national complacency.
When I saw the April balance of payments figure, my reaction was, we're stuffed.
The April current account figures caught everybody by surprise, not least the government. Just when it thought the balance was about to improve, it took a nosedive. The deficit for April reached $1,476 million, a rise of $434 million in a month.
The terms of trade problem that we became so aware of in the earlier part of '86 had in fact begun in 1985. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, if we'd been able to avoid a tax summit and get tax reform off the agenda earlier, then possibly we would have picked up that development earlier and taken remedial action earlier.
First, the economy and the dollar. No matter how you interpret yesterday's figures on Australia's balance of trade, it's bad news for the federal government.
Something had to be done, and quickly. The day after the figure was released, Paul Keating had a breakfast commitment in the electorate of Labor backbencher Neil O'Keefe. If Australians had been shocked the day before, they had experienced nothing yet.
When the car pulled up, I went out to meet him on the steps, and there was some local press there taking photos. And as we were coming up the steps, Paul said to me, look, I'm going to have to change the script for the day a bit. I know there are some things you want me to talk about and explain. I'll do that, but I'm going to have to broaden the context a bit. And I said, oh, that's okay. They're keen to learn, keen to hear. She'll be fine. And little did I know what was going to unfold.
This place, I'm sure it's quite a nice function centre, but it had all the dark stained timber. It had the dark maroon velvet curtains. It had the maroon flock wallpaper. It had the very, very heavy sort of sombreness of those sort of mock furnishings are supposed to imply. And in amongst this is all these business people hoeing into their breakfast while Paul was making a speech.
A phone was found for Keating to speak to Sydney radio personality John Laws about the crisis Australia was facing. There was only one phone he could use.
People in power prefer John Laws.
We must let Australians know, truthfully, honestly, earnestly, just what sort of an international hole Australia is in.
There's Paul having a conversation with Laws of immense national significance while there's trays of sort of croissants and coffee and orange juice and whatever else they were serving, wafting a couple of feet to the right of us. Incredibly distracting. There was this flapping kitchen door. There were these smells coming out from the kitchen. There were people yelling in the kitchen. There was just a general sense of noise and chaos around.
So I'm standing in this kitchen, and there was a woman there. It was quite amusing, really. She was irate. She had all the dishes to wash, and she was bundling them up and looking at me daggers while I'm on the telephone, standing doing this interview with Laws. But I did it, and I felt I sort of had to complete it because she was obviously so put out about the fact I was in a way.
Once you slow the growth under 3%, unemployment starts to rise again.
And then, of course, you've really induced a depression, haven't you?
Then you're gone. You know, then you're a banana republic.
I, of course, was in Canberra. Paul was in Melbourne. The interview on Laws was broadcast in Sydney, so I didn't hear it. But very shortly thereafter, journalists began to ring me and say that the Treasurer had said that Australia might become a banana republic. And I said, oh, no, I don't think that the Treasurer would have said that.
The Prime Minister, travelling in Asia, was also shocked by Keating's candour. Hawke's staff, always aware of Keating's ambition to run the country, thought he was taking too much control.
Our advice was essentially, to get onto Paul and to get him to pull his head in. He didn't act on that. He acted to find out what was happening, but he didn't do anything definitive.
Well, from the point of view of an ambassador, it was a nightmare. The press was buzzing only with concerns about events at home. There were impromptu press conferences, messages coming from all over the place. The Prime Minister having to respond to questions and comments at the same time as he had a tightly structured, busy program of deep discussions with the main leaders of the most populous country in the world.
Back home, Keating, ignoring Hawke, pushed the issue harder. He took it upon himself to change government policy. Striking out for a deal that would keep wages down, he unilaterally announced a meeting.
Effectively a mini-summit to be attended by all governments, employers and unions. It will take place within the next couple of weeks.
It was coming out loud and clear. At least 3 gallery chiefs were in the process of rescheduling their activities and getting on the first plane out of China back to Australia. On the basis that's where it was all happening. And that's where the political issues were, and that's where it was happening, that's where the leadership struggle was. And that Hawke was almost irrelevant and was behaving in a way that was almost irrelevant.
I hope it doesn't behave like a koala.
So essentially, I put it to him in the harshest terms possible that Paul had been sitting underneath for the last year, pointing upwards and saying that silly so-and-so thinks he runs the fucking country when it's run from this office. And I said, you've done nothing about it, and now it's got to this, and you've got at least 3 gallery heads in the process of booking to go back. And if that happens, you can forget it, you're stuffed. And you've just got to do something about it.
Finally, Hawke was stung into action. He briefed journalists, unprecedented for him, and ordered Acting Prime Minister Lionel Bowen to take control.
Lionel had not been involved that much with economic policy, but he was then put in charge of the processes, and I was to be sort of put back in my place until his return, where he could take the processes up. Because his staff had insisted that he was the Prime Minister, unless he looked like he was the Prime Minister and behaved like the Prime Minister, he wouldn't remain the Prime Minister.
Hawke could live with the Banana Republic outburst, but not what followed.
I didn't think that the statement was an attempt to hijack policy, although in the week that followed, with the statements and suggestions about a mini-summit that was going to be held, I wasn't too happy about the way that was done without consultation. And I made it clear at the time that I wasn't too pleased about that and took steps quite quickly from overseas, to bring that back under prime ministerial control.
It wasn't designed to be. I mean, I was prepared to say what I thought about all this, but it wasn't designed to be shattering to the government. I mean, as it turned out, it was, but it was to just sort of say baldly where, I mean, it was not to be a secret. I'd said it in Parliament, that Australia's terms of trade had fallen, that the price the world was now giving us for our commodities was much less than before, and that we couldn't pay our way without substantial remedial change.
The particular political lesson I think Paul drew from all this, not that he hadn't necessarily learned it earlier, but was that it was he who was driving the government to the tough but necessary economic outcomes and having to bring the Prime Minister with him.
The financial markets were despairing. Month after month of bad trade figures sapped their confidence in the country's future. On July 28, 1986, in a frenzy of disapproval, they drove the dollar through the floor.
It started that particular day at, I think, about 63 cents. And there had been a widely shared perception for some time that if it fell below 60, this would be a psychological barrier from which it could go into a free fall. Paul Keating was sitting opposite me with his little portable Reuters screen, which every minute or so, if you press the right button, would give you the most recent US and Australian dollar exchange rate from Sydney. He announced that it had gone below 62, below 61, below the psychological barrier of 60, and it kept on going. It bottomed at 57 that day, and only then because of pretty heavy intervention by the Reserve Bank. I was closer to despair than I'd ever been in politics, because I thought we had been a good government, certainly by Australian standards we'd been a good government, and yet we've been hit with this, and we didn't really deserve it, and how the hell were we ever going to get out of it?
This was one of those cataclysmic type situations which governments don't normally get faced with, where the Governor of the Central Bank is on the phone to the Treasurer, and I think the Prime Minister on that occasion too, because I think they were called out of ERC to take this call, and the Governor said, "I don't know what to do."
But how to tell those bronze dockers with their beach houses and barbies and cold tinnies and yachts that the good life is over?
Australia was living beyond its means. The government had to slash its spending. The 1986 budget had already been closed off for the year.
We therefore took the unprecedented step of stopping the printing presses on the budget and going into the Prime Minister's office, the Treasurer, the Prime Minister and a few advisors, and without the benefit of any papers or cabinet submissions or cabinet memorandum, sitting round knowing that we had to turn the presses on again, get these changes and turn them on again if we were going to have the budget on the normal cycle, and carve an extra couple of billion out of that budget deficit.
The Cabinet group charged with the task, the Expenditure Review Committee, was about to cut the budget with a severity rarely seen before in Australia. In 2 weeks, they took $1.5 billion off the deficit.
The decision was radical. It was also tough for the party. I mean, we had a party which had been brought up on the basis of government doing things by way of public expenditure in the areas of social welfare, education, and so on. And to be faced with the reality that we were not going to be having overall real increases caused a lot of heartburning for the party.
And I used to feel, particularly at the Expenditure Review Committee, almost physical blows as these episodes went on. I've never been in such a aggressive environment to this day, never.
The sense of crisis meant nothing was sacred. Flying in the face of Labor policy, the government lifted a ban on uranium sales to France for a paltry saving of $70 million. The The idea came from John Dawkins.
Well, we were sitting here in this room with the economy falling to bits around us, so it meant that a lot of issues which we, under normal circumstances, may not have contemplated, we just had to consider anything. And in the dying days of that budget, when we believed that we hadn't quite gone far enough, some previously unthinkable things became thinkable.
The Honourable the Treasurer.
Madam Speaker, I present the Appropriation Bill number 1, 1986-87. Madam Speaker, over the past year, the factors which determine Australia's national prosperity have changed dramatically. The strong economic growth and the huge employment growth of the last 3 years have been slowed due to the sudden collapse of our export earnings. The ban on uranium exports to France has failed to serve its original purpose.
Order!
And
the honourable member will resume his order.
Must make the point that the sale of uranium to France is not the
The honourable member behind Marshall will resume his seat. Sit down. Sit down.
Well, the federal government didn't have to wait long for reaction to its decision to lift a 3-year ban on uranium sales to France. As the Treasurer, as you heard, was outlining the decision in Parliament, 3 Labor backbenchers stormed out of the House.
I think that was probably one of the worst decisions the government took. And I suppose at the end of whatever period we have in government, that might go down as one of the silliest.
It was just really dumb. What the government did was crazy stuff. And, I mean, you couldn't have them rolled. You couldn't have... because it's the Prime Minister that gets rolled when you roll a cabinet. It's not whatever minister might have suggested at an ERC meeting. That minister's not getting rolled. It's the Prime Minister, and you can't do that. But it was just so stupid that I didn't take great pride in my work, as they say. But one does what one has to do.
The strong men of Labor had to put down a caucus revolt, which could have led to the defeat of part of the budget.
It became very clear to a lot of people that I certainly wasn't going to support the sale of uranium to France. And there was a lot of discussion around the corridors and in people's offices and generally. And as it turned out, I received a summons to attend the Minister's office, friendly summons, I might add. And it was there put to me in no uncertain terms that my vote was expected to support the government's position on the sale, and if that wasn't to be the case, then perhaps my pre-selection mightn't be as safe as it would otherwise have been. So it was put to me in short 4-letter words, fairly tight language, that my straying from the fold was just not on.
The base Labor vote was starting to decline in the mid-80s. It wasn't helped by decisions like selling uranium to France, but looking at it from a wider perspective, the real reason for the decline in the base Labor vote was simply longevity of government and the economically correct, or so the government saw, decision to keep a peg on real wage growth. I mean, ordinary wage and salary earners were not benefiting out of a Labor government.
It was the workers who were to bear the brunt of the 1986 collapse of the dollar. Instead of wages automatically rising with inflation, the government put pressure on the unions to accept real wage cuts.
Full wage indexation had been basically an article of faith amongst a lot of Labor Party people, and certainly amongst the unions in the late 70s and the 80s. And somehow or other, this was no longer consistent with making the economy work. There had to be real wage cuts. Kelty was very, very important in that.
It was a difficult task because people had said that once you move away from indexation, then inexorably it will lead to a reduction in living standards.
The government and unions were forced towards the conservative ideal of a decentralised wages system. Workers' pay would be tied partly to productivity. It was an historic step which didn't bring cheers from the factory floor.
In my view, the decision is a bastard of a decision.
I've said umpteen times, and including recently, that that's not an act you can pull twice. And if we have a big collapse in the dollar right now, God help us in terms of pulling another little trick like that.
Tom Hawke's a scab. That was the message I gave him. He scabbed on the Labor Party, the working class.
The government was at a dangerously low ebb by the end of 1986. The electorate had become angry and an election was due the following year. The Labor Party was face to face with its nightmare of short-term government.
We're not used to winning. We weren't. And that's one thing Hawke changed for the Labor Party, I hope forever. We always thought we were going to lose, so we were turning around thinking, gee, this might be another occasion where that happens.
Every caucus meeting, Hawke would stand up in his address to them, affirm the fact that we're going to win the next election. At first this was greeted with a degree of silence, then a degree of sarcasm.
So there tended to be this relapse into the, here we go, we've had our time, we've done good things, but now inevitably we go into opposition again.
Hawke maintained his faith in his ability to win elections. Out of the wilderness, he found a new source of votes. The environment would save Hawke and his government, but it would provoke the government's biggest and longest-running feud.